the Elthari had called themselves gods for so long that they had stopped remembering it was ever a claim, rather than a fact. 8,000 years of unbroken dominion across the Perseus arm had done that to them. Every species they encountered eventually knelt, not because the Elthari demanded it through conquest alone, but because their technology, their longevity, and their near-total command over the physics of their home region of space made resistance appear, to any rational observer, like a form of cosmic blasphemy. The Elthari did not conquer worlds. They ascended them, absorbing entire civilizations into a sprawling theocratic empire built around the unshakable belief that the Elthari themselves were literal divine beings, evolved beyond mortality, tasked with bringing lesser subspecies into the light of true order. High Divine Vezrath Kol, supreme voice of the Elthari ecclesiarchy, had never once in his 400-year reign encountered a species that seriously questioned this arrangement. So when Elthari scout vessels detected a small, technologically unremarkable civilization on a backwater world, called Earth, broadcasting crude radio signals into the void, Kol saw no reason to expect anything other than the same pattern that had repeated itself across 41 previous ascensions. A young species, reported Harold Desavren, presenting the scout data within the ecclesiarchy's central sanctum, a chamber built to resemble less a military command center than a cathedral of glass and starlight. Radio broadcasts suggest tribal divisions, competing belief systems, primitive weapons technology confined entirely to their home planet, no indication of any unified defense capability. Then they are ready to receive the truth of their place in creation. Kol said, his voice carrying the serene, unquestioned certainty of a being who had never once needed to doubt himself. Dispatch the Ascension Fleet. Let them see, as all have seen before them, exactly what awaits a species willing to accept its rightful position beneath the divine. It was, by every measure the Elthari had ever used to judge a target civilization, an entirely reasonable expectation. It would prove to be the single greatest error in the ecclesiarchy's 8,000-year history. 11. Years before Kol's fleet departed for Earth, a joint international task force operating from a fortified research facility in the Swiss Alps had already begun preparing for a possibility most of its own funding governments considered, at best, a costly hedge against improbable odds. Dr. Sarah Whitfield, the facility's founding director, had spent the better part of 2 decades arguing for exactly this kind of preparation, ever since anomalous signals detected by deep space listening arrays first suggested the existence of an advanced, expansionist civilization, somewhere within a few hundred light-years of Earth. What began as a modest signals intelligence program had grown, over 11 years of quiet, patient funding, into something considerably larger. A fully classified shipbuilding initiative, built beneath the cover of ordinary civilian infrastructure projects across a dozen countries, dedicated to constructing a single purpose-built vessel humanity hoped it would never actually need to deploy. They call themselves gods, Whitfield told the assembled leaders of Earth's Unified Defense Council, presenting translated fragments of intercepted Elthari communications gathered over years of careful monitoring. Every species they've ever encountered has, eventually accepted that framing, not necessarily because they believed it, but because resistance appeared genuinely futile against technology that outmatched anything a young civilization could hope to field. I don't believe the Elthari are actually divine. I believe they're simply very old, very powerful, and have never once been meaningfully challenged, and you believe humanity can be the first to challenge them, said General Thomas Reyes, chairing the emergency session. I believe humanity has one advantage no other species they've encountered has had, Whitfield said. Warning. Real, substantial warning, gathered over more than a decade, giving us time to build something specifically designed to exploit weaknesses we've identified in their doctrine. Weaknesses that exist precisely because no one has ever survived long enough to find them before. The vessel Whitfield's team had spent 11 years constructing, designated the ICE-S, Prometheus represented an engineering achievement unlike anything humanity had previously attempted. A single battleship, 4 kilometers in length, built not around conventional weapons systems, but around adaptive energy dispersal technology, developed specifically to counter the precise configuration of shielding and weaponry that intercepted Aelthari transmissions, had revealed over more than a decade of careful study. They've never needed to innovate. Whitfield told the assembled council, in her final briefing before the Aelthari fleet's arrival was projected. 8,000 years without a genuine challenge means their doctrine is frozen, ours isn't. We built the Prometheus to exploit exactly that gap. The Ascension fleet entered Earth's solar system with the same serene, unhurried confidence that had preceded 41 previous ascensions, expecting to find a species awed and immediately submissive at the mere sight of Aelthari vessels. Enormous, cathedral-like warships, adorned with the ornate religious iconography the ecclesiarchy had spent millennia perfecting as instruments of psychological domination, as much as military force. Fleet Herald Des Vren, commanding the invasion from the flagship, Vesrath's Glory, watched Earth's response with the mild, detached curiosity of someone who had overseen this exact process many times before. Deploy the divine presence broadcast across all planetary frequencies, Vren ordered. Let them witness the truth of their situation before any resistance can organize. The broadcast that followed, translated instantly by Earth's own monitoring systems, declared humanity's world formally claimed for ascension into the Aelthari ecclesiarchy, demanding immediate and total submission to the divine authority of High Divine Vesrath Kol, and promising swift, merciful correction for any species foolish tweech enough to resist the inevitable will of their gods. What Vren's fleet encountered instead of the panicked, awed submission that had characterized 41 previous ascensions was a single vessel, the ISS Prometheus, rising from Earth's orbit to meet the Ascension fleet directly, broadcasting no religious deference whatsoever, only a brief, clipped tactical communication from its commanding officer, Admiral Marcus Chen. This is Admiral Marcus Chen, of the ISS Prometheus, representing the Unified Defense Council of Earth. Your fleet has entered sovereign human space without consent. You will withdraw immediately, or we will consider your continued presence an act of war. Vren's initial reaction, relayed later in captured Aelthari communications recovered after the battle, was something between confusion and mild amusement. An emotion. Aelthari doctrine had rarely needed to process in 8,000 years of uncontested conquest. A single vessel, Vren reportedly told her own command staff, issuing demands to an Ascension fleet of 81 ships. Harold Cole will find this amusing. Proceed with standard subjugation protocol, disable the vessel and prepare it for study. Let its crew witness firsthand the futility of their resistance. What followed over the next 6 hours would be studied for generations by both human and, eventually, Aelthari military historians, as one of the most consequential single-vessel engagements in the recorded history of the Perseus arm. The Prometheus adaptive energy dispersal technology, built specifically around more than a decade of careful study of intercept Aelthari weapons signatures, proved capable of something no vessel in the ecclesiarchy's 8,000-year history had ever needed to counter: real-time reconfiguration of its own shielding to specifically neutralize the harmonic frequency patterns Aelthari weapons relied upon, patterns that had remained essentially unchanged for millennia, precisely because no opponent had ever survived long enough to force an adaptation. Commander, the human vessel's shields are adjusting, reported Vren's tactical officer, a note of genuine confusion entering her voice for what intercepted logs suggested was the first time in her 300-year career. Our primary weapons arrays are failing to penetrate. Recalibrating to secondary harmonic patterns. Recalibrate as needed, Vren ordered, still operating under the assumption that this represented a momentary technical anomaly rather than a fundamental strategic problem. Concentrate all fire on the single target. Their vessel cannot withstand our full fleet indefinitely. But concentrated fire, delivered across 81 vessels simultaneously, gave Admiral Chen's crew exactly the dataset Dr. Whitfield's team had spent a decade preparing to exploit. Each new weapons pattern the Aelthari fleet attempted was analyzed, countered, and neutralized within minutes by the Prometheus Doll's adaptive systems, systematically mapping the entirety of the ecclesiarchy's military doctrine in real time. doctrine that had never once needed to evolve, because no prior opponent had survived long enough to force it. By the third hour of the engagement, 17 Aelthari vessels had sustained catastrophic damage attempting weapons configurations that the Prometheus had already learned to counter. By the fifth hour, that number had climbed past 40, and Fleet Herald Vren found herself presiding over a battle that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the swift, sacred subjugation her entire career had prepared her to expect. "This is not possible," Vren said, watching her fleet's tactical display fill with damage indicators no Aelthari commander had ever needed to process in living memory. "They are a primitive species. Radio-age technology. This level of adaptive capability should not exist." "Herald," her intelligence officer said, her voice carrying an alarm that violated every principle of Aelthari composure. "Our analysis suggests the Humes have spent considerable time studying our weapons signatures specifically. Their entire vessel appears purpose-built to counter exactly the doctrine we have relied upon for 8,000 years. By the sixth hour, with more than half her fleet either destroyed or too critically damaged to continue effective combat operations, Fleet Herald Vren made the decision no Aelthari commander had made in the Ecclesiarchy's recorded history. She ordered a full withdrawal. "We concede this engagement." Vren transmitted to Admiral Chen, the words carrying a weight her translation systems struggled to properly convey in human languages that had never developed vocabulary for an Aelthari admitting defeat. The Ascension Fleet withdraws from this system. Admiral Chen's response, brief and without triumph, would later become one of the most quoted exchanges in the early history of humanity's contact with the wider galaxy. "Then, leave, and don't come back claiming to be gods. Gods don't lose." The Ascension Fleet's retreat, and the news of its catastrophic defeat, reached High Divine Vezrath Kol 17 days later, delivered by a shaken Herald Vren in person, within the same sanctum where the invasion had first been authorized with such serene, unquestioned confidence. "Explain to me," Kol said, his voice carrying none of its usual celestial calm, "how a species we assessed as primitive, managed to defeat an Ascension fleet that has never, in 8,000 years, failed to secure a single world it was sent to claim." Vren considered her answer carefully, having spent 17 days turning the question over in her own mind during the fleet's long, humiliated journey home. "I believe, Divine Kol, that we mistook the absence of a challenge for the impossibility of one. We have called ourselves gods for so long that we forgot gods are simply beings who have never yet met someone capable of proving them wrong. The humans did not defeat us because they possessed greater power than any species we have previously encountered. They defeated us because they spent years studying exactly how we fight, while we spent 8,000 years never once needing to consider that anyone might." The battle above Earth, brief as it was in the context of the Ecclesiarchy's ancient history, reshaped humanity's standing among the galaxy's older, more established civilizations almost overnight. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the networks of species connected to the Aelthari's sphere of influence, many of whom had lived for generations under the Ecclesiarchy's theocratic rule, having long since accepted the futility of resistance as simply another fact of their existence. For the first time in recorded memory, several of those subjugated worlds began quietly reaching out to Earth's Unified Defense Council, seeking not military alliance, but simply confirmation of what they had heard, that a species existed somewhere in a galaxy that had looked directly at the so-called gods of the Aelthari Ecclesiarchy, and refused to kneel. Admiral Marcus Chen, addressing the crew of the Prometheus, in the aftermath of the engagement that had, against every reasonable expectation, ended in decisive human victory, offered a reflection considerably more measured than the triumphant retelling the battle would eventually receive in popular human accounts. "They called themselves gods for 8,000 years," he told his assembled crew, "and I imagine, after that long, they actually started to believe it themselves. But being unchallenged for 8,000 years isn't the same thing as being unbeatable. It just means nobody's had the chance, or the reason, to prove otherwise yet. We had 11 years of warning, and we used every single one of them preparing for a fight we hoped we'd never actually have to have. That's not divine power. That's just patience, applied with enough purpose behind it." Dr. Sarah Whitfield, watching the battle's aftermath unfold from the Swiss Alps facility, that had spent 11 years quietly building the Promethean near-total secrecy, offered the assessment that would ultimately define the engagement's place in human history. They believed their own myth so completely, that they never once prepared for the possibility of losing. She said, "We didn't have the luxury of that kind of certainty. We knew exactly how outmatched we were, and we used that knowledge to build something specifically designed to close the gap, one careful year at a time. In the end, it wasn't our strength that beat them. It was the fact that we never once mistook our weakness for an excuse to stop preparing." In the years that followed, the Aelthari Ecclesiarchy's theocratic authority across the Perseus arm began, slowly and unevenly, to erode, as world after subjugated world took quiet inspiration from a single, distant battle fought by a species none of them had ever previously heard of. High Divine Vesrath Kol would spend the remainder of his long reign attempting to rebuild the unquestioned confidence his empire had relied upon for 8,000 years. Never quite succeeding in erasing the singular, uncomfortable fact that had reshaped his entire civilization's understanding of itself. That somewhere in the vast, uncharted dark beyond the edges of their ancient dominion, a species had looked at their gods, studied them carefully, and proven, decisively, that gods can be beaten by anyone patient enough to learn exactly how they fight. Earth's sky, in the months following the battle, remained calm and undisturbed, exactly as it had been before the Ascension fleet's arrival. But for the first time in the planet's long history, its people understood, with absolute clarity, precisely what they had built in 11 quiet years of preparation, and precisely what it had proven to a galaxy far larger, and far older, than anyone on Earth had ever truly imagined.